12 years in a classroom often leaves a student with a version of history where the most complex, difficult chapters are reduced to a few sentences. Standard education focuses on the familiar milestones: George Washington, the Declaration of Independence, and the Boston Tea Party. But those celebrated moments exist alongside stories that rarely make it past a footnote. Decisions that displaced millions of people, and government promises that vanished almost as soon as they were signed. Examining these forgotten pages is an essential part of understanding the nation's foundation. Every country has heroic victories and chapters they would rather ignore, but a full understanding requires reading the whole book. Long before the United States existed, North America was home to millions of people. Hundreds of distinct native nations lived across the continent, each maintaining its own government, language, and thriving agricultural community. While early relationships with European settlers involved a mix of trade and cooperation, the growing demand for land eventually overshadowed all other priorities. As settlements expanded, the territory itself became the most valuable resource on the continent. The government secured much of this land through formal treaties, promising in writing that the remaining territory belonged to native nations forever. In practice, as settlers pushed west, those treaties were routinely rewritten or ignored to facilitate further expansion. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. This policy presented native families with a violent ultimatum: abandon their ancestral homes or face forced military eviction. Thousands began an agonizing journey west, traveling hundreds of miles on foot through harsh weather, disease, and starvation. This forced relocation is remembered today as the Trail of Tears. Despite the scale of this state-sponsored removal, these communities remained resilient. After losing their lands, native nations rebuilt their societies and preserved their traditions, continuing to shape the country they refused to leave behind. By the early 1900s, another story of prosperity was unfolding in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood district was home to such a successful density of Black-owned banks, hotels, and businesses that it became known as Black Wall Street. In 1921, a single misunderstanding between a young Black man and a young white woman was used to ignite long-standing racial tensions. The situation rapidly escalated into organized, overwhelming violence against the neighborhood. Within 24 hours, the district was gone. Homes and businesses were burned to the ground, and thousands of residents were forced to flee for their safety. While the physical destruction was absolute, the aftermath was equally profound. For generations, this tragedy was omitted from history textbooks and kept out of public conversation, effectively erasing it from the collective memory of the country. This intentional silence suggests that the erasure of a community's history can be as damaging as its physical destruction. During the Great Depression, the entire nation was gripped by economic desperation. With jobs gone and banks failing, millions were simply trying to survive. Among those in need were thousands of World War I veterans. They had been promised bonus payments for their service, but the government had scheduled those payments for years into the future. Desperate for the funds to support their families, more than 15,000 veterans and their families marched on Washington, D.C. They formed a peaceful encampment, asking the government to honor its financial promise early. The government responded by deploying active duty soldiers, cavalry, and military tanks to clear the camps. Loyal veterans who had served the country were forcibly removed by the same military they once belonged to. The event illustrated a grim reality. When economic stability is threatened, the state is capable of using military force against its own citizens to maintain the status quo. That capacity for state action reappeared during World War II. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, a climate of intense fear and suspicion directed toward people of Japanese ancestry spread across the United States. In 1942, the government forced over 120,000 people, the vast majority of them U.S. citizens, to leave their homes and relocate to remote internment camps. The government stripped these families of their livelihoods and constitutional rights without ever producing evidence of wrongdoing. The policy relied on racial prejudice and the broad panic of wartime. This culture of paranoia intensified during the Cold War. As global rivalry peaked, U.S. military leadership grew increasingly concerned with the rise of Fidel Castro's government in Cuba. Military officials drafted a proposal known as Operation Northwoods, which detailed plans to stage fake, violent attacks on Americans that could be blamed on Cuba to provide a justification for war. President Kennedy fully rejected the military proposal, but declassified documents eventually proved that the highest levels of military leadership had actively planned to deceive the public and sacrifice lives for political objectives. National security and deep-seated fear can create an environment where leaders justify plotting against their own citizens or legalizing the removal of their liberties. A nation's history is a human narrative. It isn't a simple choice between heroism and failure. It is a complex record containing both. The impact of broken treaties, erased communities, and military force against citizens does not end when a chapter closes. These moments establish the precedents and tensions that still influence modern social and political life. Understanding the full story requires us to look beyond the highlights and ask what other pivotal moments might be missing from the history we were taught. History is defined by what we choose to remember. Share in the comments which part of this story stood out to you most, and subscribe as we continue to look into the chapters that were left behind.